Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing amazing. Of course, we got Old Britannia once more. This is called Austria Against the Revolution. Of course, we're talking about the French Revolution, how they acted, and so forth. I'm not sure. This is going to be a fun video, though. Strap in. Let's go.
Imagine you ruled over an empire of 25 million people, divided by race, language, and political system. Against you stands a ruthlessly centralised nation of 40 million, united around an iron conscription law of a type you would never be able to implement in your own domains.
No, because they're not as subservient or could be unified as you just spoke about, because we just looked at that a couple of days ago. Just like the split, the ethnic split between the Italians, the Slavs, the Hungarians, the Romanians, etc. It's just Germany's a different case, but Austria is an interesting one.
How do you go about fighting this enemy? Is it even possible to fight him? This was the question posed by Archduke Charles to the Emperor of Austria as French revolutionary and then Napoleonic armies swept over Europe and threatened to carry away the Habsburg monarchy with them. The actual Austrian response, blundering, incompetent, but also brave and doggedly resistant to the extent nobody could have expected, was to set the course of the empire for the rest of its existence. To begin with though, when Vienna first heard rumblings of the events transpiring in Paris, the monarchy had problems elsewhere. The war against the Turks had been an expensive and costly failure. Austrian armies had finally conquered significant chunks of Serbia and ejected the Ottomans from the Danubian principalities, but it had taken too long, and now Prussia was on the verge of sweeping down into an undefended Bohemia. Belgium was in revolt and Austria had no troops to spare, whilst the Hungarians also seemed ready to rise at any moment.
And it's like this all the time, like volatility at all sides. Like even like we were looking in the 19th century, like the late 19th century, you'll have Italy, Russia, Prussia, Hungary, like internal strifes and everywhere.
In Paul Schroeder's words, what saved Austria in early 1790 was the accession of one of the most shrewd and sensible monarchs to ever wear a crown, Joseph's brother Leopold. Leopold had spent most of his adult life in Tuscany, ruling as its Grand Duke. There he had passed a series of enlightened reforms, many of them similar to his brothers in Austria.
So he's got some good experience even.
Though Leopold's had come with the additional benefit of not nearly tearing the country apart. From Italy, he had repeatedly warned Joseph that moving too quickly, without respect for the monarchy's historic traditions, was bound to fail. Now it was his job to save it from complete disintegration. To this end, Leopold was careful in his actions from the start. He chose to arrive in Vienna only after Joseph had died, so as to avoid any association with the previous regime. This was a harsh farewell, for Joseph had actually gifted Leopold an easier opening to his reign than may have been expected, repealing most of his edicts on his deathbed.
Dang, there's got to be some sour faces to that, right?
Save for the abolition of serfdom and decree of tolerance. This did not quell the troubles stirring in Hungary, the Tyrol or Bohemia, but it meant Leopold would not have to begin his rule by capitulating to every single demand. The most pressing task was to restore peace in Buda. If Prussia invaded, there was a genuine chance the Hungarians would coordinate the overthrow of the Habsburgs. Leopold responded by summoning the Hungarian Diet, long ignored by both Joseph and Maria Theresa. Through tedious negotiations that he handled skillfully, a compromise was eventually reached.
What a painting. What a painting. There's so much going on here. Got the balcony, got these interesting colors. Wow.
Most of Joseph's centralising reforms were to be undone. Hungary would again be recognised as an independent country, with some minor modifications. Taxation would now have to be voted upon by the Diet, and Magyar was to be taught in schools. Serfdom was effectively reinstated in all but name. These were concessions, but not a complete capitulation. Leopold had shrewdly played the Magyars and their own large minority populations off each other in the negotiations, and shown he was not completely at their mercy. By mid-1790, Leopold had restored internal peace inside the core Habsburg monarchy without having to undo either Maria Theresa's reforms or even many of Joseph's more efficacious changes, such as those to administrative and judicial organisation. He could now look to foreign affairs. The immediate Austrian predicament was Prussia's obvious signals about a coming invasion of Bohemia, whilst Habsburg troops were concentrated against the Ottoman Empire. Leopold decided it was thus better to escape the Turkish war with whatever he could get, so
Yeah, well, there's nothing to gain anymore. Like, there's so much happening in Europe right now. Just leave it how it is.
as to deter Prussia. In this, he faced opposition from Kaunitz, still clinging to power. He argued making peace with the Turks just when Austria was finally winning the war would be humiliating. Instead, he proposed Austria should fight Prussia as well, by drawing Russia into the war. Leopold listened intently to Kaunitz, the way Joseph and Maria Theresa had done, and then ignored him.
Dang.
In the summer of 1790, he met Prussian delegates at the town of Reichenbach to negotiate a settlement. Frederick William, the Prussian king, eventually offered an ultimatum. The Austrians could either have war with him or settle for a status quo antebellum peace with Turkey. Leopold chose the latter. The Convention of Reichenbach, signed on the 27th of July, was by all official metrics a humiliation for Austria. A costly war with the Turks that was just starting to bear victorious fruit was abandoned for nothing but a few border fortresses.
So, but it's chess, right? Right? You gotta take concessions where you have to. Like, otherwise, you would have been in a long-standing Prussian conflict that would have it would have just went over the top, and then the impending interesting stuff that's happening in the West.
Prussia had, on paper, achieved a great success for her prestige. The reality, however, was that Leopold had extricated Austria from a potentially catastrophic strategic position with nothing but her pride dented. The Habsburgs really would have struggled to fund new administrations in acquired Turkish territories anyway, and Reichenbach agreed Austria could reconquer its much more valuable Belgian provinces, the revolt of which Prussia had until then been not so discreetly supporting. On the 22nd of September, an Austrian army freed up by the end of the war in the Balkans dispatched a rebel force at Valmain and retook the Low Countries. For the first time in nearly a decade, the Habsburg monarchy was at peace both
We're back where we started, basically.
internally and externally. It was not to last. Leopold had always genuinely sought peace, believing it was the best way of both stabilising his empire and growing it economically. He was unfortunate then to have inherited it at one of the most turbulent times in European history. The French Revolution, begun in 1789, was by 1791 spiralling out of control. France had, for more than 30 years, been Austria's key ally in Europe. 3 centuries of conflict and competition seemed to be behind them, but in Paris the Habsburg alliance was increasingly viewed with disdain.
And now you have a bunch of territories that this crazy revolution is bordering. What's going to happen to the lowlands? What's going to happen to, what's going to happen to the government of France?
France, it seemed to many, had only ever lost in the Union. The one visible gain, Leopold's sister Marie Antoinette, was, as far as the Parisian mob were concerned, the equivalent of contracting herpes from an already abusive relationship. To begin with, though, both sides engaged in a wary standoff. Leopold had little love for the French royalist émigrés that were fleeing the country, who either demanded obnoxious favours or tried to provoke an even more obnoxious war. Instead, the Emperor's strategy was aimed at building a European alliance system to deter any French expansionism.
So Austria's like in a really good spot here because now they actually have a scapegoat for like the concept of Europe. They were the scapegoat so many times before because of their volatility or their conquest ambitions or their territory aims that they try to portray. But now it's kind of like flipped on its head, and it becomes very opportunistic for Austria to be in the good graces of the great powers. The great powers meaning Russia, Prussia, and the UK. So within this system that we have here, it feels like, I want to take advantage of this in the best way possible, but also serve good.
This, he hoped, would see the revolution contained and eventually settle down along moderate constitutional lines. Only once, when he received a false report that the French royal family had successfully escaped the country, does he seem to have considered military intervention to restore Louis XVI to his former powers. To this end, he issued a circular at Padua on the 6th of July, asking other monarchs to join in demanding his sister's freedom. Then, on the 27th of August, he did what Joseph never could, and finally buried the hatchet with Prussia, making a joint declaration with Frederick William from Pillnitz.
I mean, the enemy of my enemy is your friend, or is my friend, becomes very prominent here, right? Like I said, Prussia and Austria have a similar aim. That's why they're able to come to the table. Now, if France and the revolution was not happening, I don't know.
Itself, the declaration was quite conservative with its wording, but it was the first step in Leopold's hope of a European alliance system to contain France. Although the Emperor still sought to avoid war, from November 1791, both Paris and Vienna spiralled inexorably towards it. The French complained about royalist émigrés in German city-states, whilst they hosted other nations' revolutionary dissidents in Paris. Austria reinforced the Low Countries and the Rhine. Several factions in France began to see war with the hereditary enemy as a way of uniting their divided country.
Wow.
Seeing which way the wind was blowing, the Austrians and Prussians negotiated a more formal alliance on the 7th of February. On the 20th of April 1792, complaining of encirclement by the forces of reaction, France declared war on Austria.
About to get Valmy.
The announcement began more than 20 years of struggle in which the Habsburgs would be revolutionary and then Napoleonic France's most clumsy yet intractable foe. Far in excess of Frederick's campaigns, the wars with France would reshape the European continent and Austria's place within it. Ultimate victory would eventually arrive, but not before the Habsburg monarchy suffered a long and miserable procession of misfortunes.
Yeah, we're going to see territory loss, we're going to see the dissolution of the HRE, we're going to see countless deaths.
The first of which came before war was even declared. In March, Leopold had suddenly died at the age of 44.
Dang, this is when... Is it Joseph?
Apparently of pneumonia. He had ruled the Habsburg monarchy for less than 2 years, yet in that short time he had dealt with its most pressing internal problems.
It seems like him, and we also watched, was it Schwarzenberg previously? It seems like the heavier the toll of work, the quicker the death.
Restored her as a great power, and taken the lead in countering revolutionary France. He would not have prevented war had he lived. He would probably not have prevented France's extraordinary military successes. He would, however, have been a far more worthy opponent of the revolution and Napoleon. For Austria, it was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest losses the monarchy ever suffered. The fate of the empire, had Leopold been given another decade or two at the helm, would have been very different. His successor was his 24-year-old son, Francis. Despite more than 40
Francis, that's right.
years on the throne, his reign has produced none of the interest that surrounds his three colourful and dynamic predecessors. Francis had his charms. He was intelligent, industrious, and could be decisive when it mattered, but he combined this with narrow-minded pettiness against both ideas and people. Dependable, plodding, and unimaginative, he was, quite frankly, just rather dull. Although he had been raised in Tuscany under the enlightened rule of his father, as monarch he would abandon the notions of Joseph and Leopold in reaction to the revolution. Francis would have been an adequate if unremarkable monarch in peacetime. Like his father, it was his misfortune to inherit in a moment of existential peril for the monarchy instead. In March 1792, however, the situation did not seem so desperate. Francis was easily confirmed as Holy Roman Emperor, the rest of the Habsburg monarchy united behind him with little fuss, and the Prussian alliance held, though it took until June for them to also declare war on France. Yet things began to go wrong quickly. The grand European alliance that Leopold had hoped for never materialised. Catherine of Russia was too busy with her machinations against Poland to bother much about France. Whilst
I mean, it's so far away, it hasn't really became something that's necessarily threatening quite yet.
the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, ignored Edmund Burke's pleas for a counter-revolutionary crusade and instead adopted a wary neutrality. A Prussian army easily took Verdun, but its commander, the Duke of Brunswick, then turned the war into an ideological one by issuing a bizarre manifesto that threatened to raze Paris to the ground if King Louis were harmed. Already re-energised by the proclamation of a republic on the 10th of August, and now suitably galvanised by Brunswick, the Army of Lawyers, as the French were contemptuously dubbed, beat back the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy.
Yeah, and this was a huge loss, like, huge loss.
Austria fared little better, losing at Jemappes in November and opening the way for the conquest of Belgium. The initial attempts to defeat France had ended in debacle. Prussia had to share the blame as much as Austria. Both powers coordinated the assault badly.
Yeah, imagine if Austria and Prussia coordinated, like, to a T. How would this war have been different?
Still suspicious of each other's motives and struggling to really define any concrete war goals. Ironically though, defeat finally brought about something resembling the European coalition Leopold had hoped would prevent war in the first place. Brunswick's note and the subsequent French military successes combined to lose King Louis his head in January 1793. The regicide revolted all of Europe and genuinely shocked Francis.
And then his aunt dies. Francis's aunt will die in the same day or days later.
In the following months, Spain, Portugal, and several Italian states entered into the struggle. Britain, more concerned about French threats towards Holland, was also unsurprised to receive a French declaration of war in February. French aggression, more than Austrian diplomatic skill, had finally birthed an alliance capable of smothering the revolution in its cradle, but it came at a price. Prussia now demanded territorial indemnities from elsewhere, particularly Poland if it were to wage another campaign. Russia still refused to lift a finger.
Like, what's in it for me is just the continuation of this. Like, well, okay, what do I get out of this? Well, you survive, but then it's so many back channels that like, survival is like so obvious to a lot of these nations, but this is pre-Napoleon.
And for now Britain's only contribution was urging the Austrians to fight harder, with allies like these. Kaunitz had finally retired soon after Francis's accession, but in his last major intervention suggested, perhaps wisely, that Austria should try to escape the war as honourably as possible, rather than continuing to fight it.
Maybe.
For a final time, he was ignored. Nonetheless, for a brief moment, victory seemed possible. In March, an Austrian attempt to recover Belgium met with almost total success at the Battle of Neerwinden. With a royalist uprising in the Vendée and a revolt at the great naval base of Toulon later in the year, it genuinely seemed as if the revolution would soon be overturned. Yet the initiative once again slipped away from the Allies. The Austrian commander, the Prince of Coburg, declined to march on Paris in the wake of his victory in Belgium. Like most in Vienna, he was sceptical about the utility of restoring the Bourbons by force. Instead, Coburg was more interested in securing territorial gains.
Of course.
The strategy inevitably gave France, now mobilising for an all-out revolutionary struggle, time to recover. Toulon was recaptured by a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte.
Who?
Soon after, the Vendée revolt stagnated, and in the north Anglo-Austrian forces were put back on the defensive. It was only at this point, a year after Louis XVI had been executed, that the Habsburgs began to understand what they were dealing with. Until now, they'd been fighting the war as if it were another 18th century spat over Silesia with Frederick, expecting that the revolution would eventually be overturned from the inside. Now, Vienna began to fear that unless it was destroyed quickly and by force, it would never be destroyed at all. It was a realisation that came too late. The French Revolutionary War machine clicked into gear in 1793, recruiting and organising masses of men that Austria could never hope to match.
Yeah, so much more men that Austria has, but collectively, that's why you have a coalition that does outmatch you in men.
The next year, in June 1794, they defeated a Habsburg army at Fleurus and overran the Austrian Netherlands for good. The Prussians, already lax in their support anyway, finally dropped out of the war completely. Tuscany and Spain soon followed. Holland and the left bank of the Rhine fell to the advancing French tide as well. British armies evacuated across the Channel, Austrian ones fell back into Germany. Should the Habsburgs now also abandon ship? That was the question Emperor Francis had to ponder in 1795. Austrian distractions in the west had already caused them to miss out in the east. The Habsburgs had taken part in the first partition of Poland in 1772, but since then had anxiously tried to avoid another land grab, which could only strengthen Prussia and Russia. Leopold in particular had been in favour of promoting a series of enlightened reforms in the country, making it once more a viable state. But Austria's preoccupation with France had given an opening once more for its two rivals in the region. In 1793, Berlin and Petersburg again partitioned the country,
It's basically nothing at this point.
ignoring Austria completely.
Wow.
It was clear the war with France was distracting Vienna from its other commitments, but the new foreign minister, Turgot, decided against any serious peace proposals. A highly competent and efficient civil servant, he was devoted to the idea of counter-revolutionary struggle against France, but also understood there were practical reasons for continuing the war. The Austrian treasury, as usual, was bare, and
As usual. Just love how the casual, as usual, they had nothing.
Vienna's hopes were placed on floating a huge war loan backed by Britain, hopefully to be repaid through the spoils of victory. But victory continued to elude Austria. The main theatre of war remained Germany, the Habsburgs' primary sphere of influence and the most direct route to Vienna. Initial losses here in 1796 were surprisingly reversed by the emergence of Archduke Charles as a military commander, a younger brother of Francis and only 25 that year. He would prove to be Austria's greatest commander in the long struggle with France.
Yeah, that's one thing I do remember. He was good.
In a series of battles, he decisively defeated and drove back across the Rhine both Jourdan and Moreau, particularly impressive considering the latter was probably France's finest military mind at that point.
Wow.
With the revolutionary government's finances ruinous, the army suffering mass desertions, and war weariness spreading throughout the country, it once again seemed as if decisive success was within reach. Habsburg luck, as usual, did not hold. In Italy, a newly promoted General Bonaparte turned an until then irrelevant theatre of war into his adopted country's salvation, smashing Austrian forces in the field,
And Piedmont.
knocking Piedmont out of the conflict,
Easily.
and eventually forcing a Habsburg retreat across the Alps. News of the victories and loot from the conquered territories helped restore the French public's morale and stave off bankruptcy. In 1797, Bonaparte staged a daring assault across the Alps and came within 60 miles of Vienna. Charles, reassigned from Germany, led the Austrian retreat with courage and skill, but knew the game was up and demanded an armistice from his brother, which Bonaparte himself negotiated. 6 months of diplomatic wrangling followed, eventually concluding with the Treaty of Campo Formio. France was to take the left bank of the Rhine, most of northern Italy, including the rich province of Lombardy. Austria would be compensated with Venetian territory, and through maintaining its overlordship of Germany. Yet both of these came with caveats. Bonaparte ensured Venice was stripped of most of its wealth before handing it over, whilst the French government spent endless amounts of time demanding buffer states across the Rhine, ensuring everyone in Vienna knew its interests remained aggressive there.
And this is a whole separate topic, but I wonder, one thing I've always been curious about, like, for example, there's Milan, there's Venice, there's other places definitely in this area as well. All that art, all those artifacts, right, do they get shipped to Paris at this point?
It marked a new era in European politics. The revolution had survived. The Habsburgs now had to learn how to live with it. The way this initially expressed itself was through renewed war. Campo Formio was considered acceptable by many in Vienna. The heavy Austrian losses in the war meant she had gotten off lightly. But the terms were soon threatened by France. In Italy, Bonaparte turned his new Cisalpine Republic, whose independence had been guaranteed by the treaty, into an open French satellite. French control over Switzerland was also consolidated, threatening Austria in southern Germany, Italy and its core territories. Over a year, the slide to war became inevitable once more. On his way to campaign in Egypt, Bonaparte had attacked the Knights of Malta, infuriating the new Russian Tsar Paul, who viewed himself as a protector of small states, and finally made the Great Eastern Bear amenable to a coalition against France. With Bonaparte's army trapped in Egypt after a crushing naval defeat at the Nile, the time now
Because the UK would take care of that.
seemed ripe to form a new front against France. Again though, the usual problems persisted. Prussia refused to abandon its profitable neutrality, relations with Britain remained sour over finances, whilst much of the Austrian military establishment moaned the army was not yet ready for another clash with France.
I think it's so obvious that Prussia just wanted uh, a weaker Austria, and they wanted France, albeit they probably did not think that France was going to be stronger in this process because they were already deteriorated, because they didn't have a strong government, a central government at this time. So Prussia probably just sat in the background just because they thought this could only hurt Austria, and if we stay neutral, we'll be in the best position possible.
Yet the mirage of victory once more appeared in front of the Habsburgs. The new alliance with Russia produced a remarkable string of military victories under Alexander Suvorov. He'd been named commander of the combined Austro-Russian army in Italy by Francis, mainly to flatter the Tsar, and all of his staff, support services, and over half of his men were Austrian. Nonetheless, by mid-August, 2 French armies had been virtually destroyed and a third was bottled up in Genoa. Almost all of Italy had been retaken, and France once again seemed open to invasion. Again, though, victory was not to be had. The rout of a Russian army in Switzerland increased further already high tensions between Petersburg and the rest of the coalition. Paul, always schizophrenic in his policies, now took Russia out of the war altogether. In France, the miserable Directory that had ruled for 4 years was overthrown by Bonaparte, after he'd abandoned his army in Egypt to seize power in a military coup. Yet Austria continued to risk war, even though she was now once more fighting alone, with British aid remaining limited. If they could hold Italy and maintain a grip on Germany, they would still end the war in a better position than when they had begun it. But in mid-1800, Bonaparte crossed the Alps and defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. This was not actually the decisive battle of the war, though Bonaparte subsequently made it out to have been. If he had lost, which he very nearly did, it would not have saved Austria. 6 months later, General Moreau won the more decisive victory at Hohenlinden, which left the French almost within sight of Vienna. The Treaty of Lunéville, signed in 1801, changed Campo Formio little, but marked a clear end to the revolutionary part of the wars for Austria. Future conflicts were to have less of an ideological bend to them, and focus more on territorial and balance of power concerns. A decade of war had produced little result for the Habsburgs. They had lost Belgium, the left bank of the Rhine, most of Italy, and seen their authority in Germany fatally weakened.
Yeah, they've been spiraling.
The French Revolution had, at least in Western Europe, triumphed, soon to be consolidated by Bonaparte. Yet all was not completely bleak. If the Habsburgs' grip on European affairs had decayed, in the hereditary lands, internal strife finally seemed to have come to an end. All were prepared to contribute to the war effort, and there was never any serious inkling of the revolution spreading into Austria itself. But in 1801, more than a decade of struggle still lay ahead for the Habsburgs, and there was no guarantee the dynasty would emerge intact.
What a video. What a video. So much knowledge just thrown at us at once, especially around like the Austrian POV, the Habsburg POV in the time of terror for Europe. And just like I said before, it's interesting how like the alliances just coalesce and how some people remain neutral just for maybe a better a better hand of cards for the next round of European madness. Russia's interesting POV on this as well, and of course poor Poland just gets continuously sliced up, as we know. UK kind of being the silent but violent naval power that funds the war but also contains the war. Wow. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave me some video suggestions down below. As always, go subscribe to Old Britannia. Great channel. Appreciate you guys. Peace out. Bye-bye.